This is Lecture 18. Today, we're going exploring. For the last 3 lectures, we've been occupied a good deal with life's past. That was clearly the case in the work of Georges Cuvier on the world of prehistoric beasts, and it obviously applied to Jean-Baptiste Lamarck's understanding of the evolution of life. Life's past was less directly a concern of the North British in their debates about volcanism and Neptunism. That had more to do with the Earth's geological past, but the history of life was central to the work of William Buckland as he set out to convince his colleagues at Oxford that natural science was crucial for understanding world history. Those were the last 3 lectures. Today, I want to talk about the present. Not our present. I mean the present for those who were living in the early 19th century. Specifically, I want to introduce you to 2 individuals from this general period who set out to explore the world of their day. That included both the physical world and the things that were living in it. I'm talking about Alexander von Humboldt and Charles Darwin. Both of these men set out on extended voyages of discovery that would last 5 years. They did it some 30 years apart, von Humboldt at the beginning of the century and Darwin in 1831. But their purposes were similar. In fact, as we'll see, von Humboldt's journey provided one of the motivations for Darwin's. Now, voyages of exploration had been going on well before the 19th century. We're all familiar with the famous voyages of discovery from the early modern period. They included, after all, Columbus's trips to the New World. And there were lots of other early explorers. The most important of these pre-19th century voyages for our purposes, however, occurred in the 18th century. 2 of them, for example, were particularly inspiring to the young Alexander von Humboldt, one of today's subjects. One of these 18th century journeys was undertaken by Louis Antoine de Bougainville, who became the first Frenchman to sail all the way around the world in a voyage that lasted from December 1766 to March 1769. He took the king's naturalist and botanist with him, so we know that collecting information about the natural world was one part of his mission. And when he came back, Bougainville wrote an account of his adventures that became one of von Humboldt's favorite childhood books. So, even as a youth, von Humboldt was dreaming of going off to see the world and learning about the strange creatures that inhabited its remote parts. And then, when he was 21 years old, von Humboldt actually met and traveled in Europe with one of the 2 naturalists who had been aboard Captain Cook's second voyage of 1772. This was Georg Forster, whose tales also inspired the impressionable young von Humboldt. In fact, he later called Forster his guiding star. So who was this Alexander von Humboldt anyway? Well, I can tell you right up front that Alexander von Humboldt was Europe's leading international man of natural science during the first half of the 19th century. And the main reason that he rose to such fame, although certainly not the only reason, was his trip to the Americas from 1799 to 1804. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. As you can tell from his name, von Humboldt was the son of a nobleman. His father, who died when Alexander was just a boy, was an officer in Frederick the Great's Prussian army. So when Alexander was born in 1769, he came into a world of wealth and privilege. He wasn't ever really going to have to worry about making money. By the same token, that meant that he wouldn't follow the normal educational pattern of young Germans. Middle-class young men would normally follow their early training in elementary and secondary schools with attendance at a university where they pursued a degree. This they did in one of the 4 faculties that existed at the time. These 4 faculties were first the philosophy faculty. That was a general faculty that included most of what we would think of as the arts and sciences. This, incidentally, is where you would likely pursue natural philosophy. The other 3 faculties were the so-called higher faculties. They were almost like professional faculties. They dealt with more specialized studies. And the professions that mattered here were law, medicine, and theology. Now, this particular set of faculties might strike you as an odd combination to designate as higher, but when you think about it, they train students in how to keep people healthy, how to settle their differences, and how to take care of their souls. Pretty much takes care of life right around all over. Well, von Humboldt, like many children of noblemen, had a private tutor. That took care of his early training. He had no real need for a degree, but he was the curious sort, and he did attend various universities and academies for a few semesters. And that made up the formal part of his education. But von Humboldt had access to another source of education that was not open to most people. It was his exposure to the cultural life in Berlin. In fact, this is what really accounts for his intellectual development. In the very first lecture, I referred to the salons of Berlin during the late 18th century that rivaled those in France, which are perhaps more well known. It was the Jewish intellectual community of Berlin that supported some of the best salon life there at the time. Von Humboldt himself was not Jewish, but he eagerly joined into the wide-ranging discussions of this intellectual atmosphere of the Enlightenment Jewish community there in Berlin, in the salons. And he found there the kind of stimulation that really excited his mind. Now, I said that he didn't have to worry about money. That didn't stop Alexander from pursuing a career. In fact, his mother had encouraged him to make himself useful. Well, he'd always been interested in the study of nature, and one of the many areas of his interests was mineralogy. So he determined to make his study of mineralogy practical by becoming a mining administrator, which he accomplished by the age of 23. It wasn't until a few years later that his mother died and he was informed about the details of his inheritance, and what he learned was that he was extremely wealthy. And of course, now he was independent. He decided to give up his career in mining administration and undertake scientific research on various problems. In fact, it was one of these problems, one on animal electricity, that first brought von Humboldt to our attention back in Lecture 12. That was his demonstration that you could generate the electricity needed to make a frog's leg contract using just one metal, not two, as Volta was saying. During this period, I'm talking here about the late 1790s, he spent considerable time in Jena and Weimar. These were the centers of the German Romantic movement that was well underway. Here he got to know Goethe, Schelling, and other prominent figures of the so-called Romantic circle, and they got to know him. But all along, that childhood dream of traveling nagged away at him. That was his real goal, to undertake a voyage of discovery in the tradition of his boyhood heroes. And now that he'd become involved with natural philosophy, he imagined taking a different kind of trip. He would go to the Americas for the purpose of conducting scientific research. And he realized his dream. In fact, it was the first journey of exploration that was undertaken solely for the purpose of gathering information about the world and its creatures. First, he went off to Paris in 1798, where he witnessed for himself the excitement Cuvier was causing. He met all the French savants. He even met the aging explorer Bougainville. Among those he became acquainted with was a French botanist named Aimé Bonpland. They hit it off with each other, and von Humboldt invited Bonpland to join him in a research expedition to the Spanish colonies. So they set off for Spain, where they had an audience with the king and queen in Madrid. This was a wise move. Why? Because they were able to acquire special passports that guaranteed the cooperation of Spanish colonial authorities in assisting their research. Finally, in June of 1799, the two left Spain for South America. Thanks to von Humboldt's personal wealth, they were better equipped for research than any travelers before them. As he departed, von Humboldt made clear what his goals were. He wrote that he intended to collect plants and fossils and make astronomical observations. Nothing that novel in this. That was kind of assumed, but when it came to expressing his basic motivation, von Humboldt took a grand view. His main purpose, he said, and these are his words, was to find out how the forces of nature interact upon one another and geographic environment influences plant and animal life. He had another goal. I must find out, he said, about the unity of nature. This preoccupation with nature's many forces and their unification impressed a lot of people in these years. Later we'll explore this topic specifically in Lecture 25. the first one of the series on physical science and culture. The journey took the two travelers first to Venezuela, where they spent a year exploring the coast and the interior. In February of 1800, they set out to explore the relatively unknown region of the Upper Orinoco. This was the tropics with a vengeance. They endured unspeakable hazards, snakes, jaguars, and worst of all, mosquitoes, and a host of other biting insects from which escape was impossible. Von Humboldt collected specimens of plants everywhere he went. He took readings of the heavens, of barometric pressure, the temperature of the bodies of water there. And he and Bonpland decided then that they were going to try to confirm the existence of a canal that some claimed linked the two great river systems of the Orinoco and the Amazon. After the two explorers found and traversed what is known today as the Cassiquiare Canal, its existence was no longer in dispute. From Venezuela, the pair took a brief trip to Cuba, and from there, they embarked on a 2-year exploration of the Andes of Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. It was in Ecuador that von Humboldt accomplished the deed that brought him more fame than any other single accomplishment. He climbed Mount Chimborazo, almost to the summit, got up to over 19,000 feet. At the time, it was thought to be the highest mountain in the world, so you can see why it made him famous. While in Peru, incidentally, he took readings of the cold current off the coast. Now, he wasn't the first one to discover this current, but it still bears his name to this day. The final stage of the trip lasted another year and a half, took von Humboldt to Mexico, and then the United States. He came first to Philadelphia, where he met with American natural philosophers. His real goal, however, was to go to the new capital in Washington. He wanted to meet Thomas Jefferson, whose writings, he said, had inspired him from his earliest years. With Jefferson, he discussed many scientific subjects, and of course, Jefferson quizzed him about his knowledge of the inhabitants of the territory recently acquired from France, the Louisiana Purchase. Von Humboldt shared maps with Jefferson that he had made during his stay in Mexico. And then it was back to Europe, finally, after 5 full years away. He had regularly sent word home of his adventures, and they had been reported on during his absence. There had also been rumors of his death in the wild that circulated among people in Europe. All these reports established him permanently as a celebrated man of natural philosophy when he came back to Europe and proved the rumors of his death were untrue. For example, his appearance in Paris in August of 1804 made him the center of public attention. Historian of astronomy Agnes Clark has noted that at one time, Alexander von Humboldt was the most famous man in Europe with the exception of Napoleon Bonaparte. Naturally, he was presented at court, but Napoleon himself was jealous of von Humboldt's fame. He received von Humboldt coldly and condescendingly, it was reported. As you might anticipate, von Humboldt's books, including the accounts of his travels that began appearing in 1814, were widely read. He decided to stay in France. He really liked Paris and his celebrated position there. In fact, he lived in Paris until 1827, when finally he was recalled to Prussia and Berlin by the King of Prussia. The following year, he gave the keynote address to the new German Association of Natural Scientists, as we'll learn in a later lecture when we explore the new institutions of natural science that had begun to appear in the 1820s. And then, in the 1840s, the first books of von Humboldt's multi-volumed work, entitled simply Cosmos, began making their appearance. Cosmos was, according to historian William Langer, the most widely read book of the time other than the Bible. So von Humboldt was an enormously influential person during the first half of the 19th century. And among those whom he influenced was a young Englishman named Charles Darwin. Darwin's the other explorer we want to examine today. Charles Darwin's voyage around the world was the decisive event of his life, in my opinion. There were some ways in which Darwin was like von Humboldt and other ways in which he was different. One of the ways he was like von Humboldt was that Darwin was also born to wealth and privilege. Now, I hasten to add that Darwin was not an aristocrat like von Humboldt was, but he still enjoyed the comfortable life of the landed gentry who frequently intermarried with aristocrats in England. Darwin's father was a successful and wealthy physician. He had worked hard for what he had, and he believed, like lots of 19th century English upper middle class people, that his son should do the same. So Robert Darwin, the father, exerted pressure on his son Charles to choose a career befitting of someone of his station. Charles was sent off to university, initially with the understanding that he would follow in his father's medical footsteps. But Darwin found the prospect of becoming a physician distasteful. There are stories about this. For example, how Darwin lost his breakfast while watching surgeons at work in Edinburgh, where he had gone to prepare for his medical career. But the short of it was, there was no way Darwin was going into medicine, and he had to break this to his father. He left Edinburgh and went to Cambridge University, where he finished his degree in January of 1831. Worked out an agreement with his father that in the fall, he'd return and begin the specialized study necessary for the ministry. That, after all, was a perfectly respectable career for a young man. In fact, some of Darwin's relatives of his own age were choosing that route. But Darwin got hold of von Humboldt's personal narrative. This was the English translation of von Humboldt's account of his travels in the New World. Darwin simply devoured it. He, too, had an idea of traveling to exotic lands. He had romped around the Scottish countryside and seashore when he was in Edinburgh, and at Cambridge, he'd continued his study of natural philosophy, so he developed the idea of going to the Canary Islands sometime before settling down as a country parson. Then everything changed for him, for the better. Came that summer, before he was to go back to Cambridge, in the fall, in the form of a letter from his favorite professor there, one John Henslow. Henslow and Darwin had done a lot of field trips together, and Henslow knew of Darwin's considerable abilities as an observer of nature. He wondered if Darwin might be interested in providing the company of a gentleman to the captain of an exploratory voyage to Terra del Fuego. Darwin's social status as an educated upper middle class member of society, while not exactly equal to that of the captain, would still provide much better company than would be available otherwise among a crew of sailors. Well, of course, Darwin was ready to sign up immediately. But there was that understanding with his father and the expectation that he'd go back to Cambridge that fall. It took some doing, but eventually Charles persuaded his father that a trip like this was not a waste of time. In fact, it had real benefits to a future clergyman to know how wonderful God's creation really was. Anyway, he got past this barrier and a few others before he finally departed on the HMS Beagle in December of 1831 for what would be a 5-year circumnavigation of the globe. I should add that Darwin was not designated the ship's naturalist, as is sometimes thought. That claim by custom went to the ship's surgeon, in this case one Robert McCormick, who regarded the voyage as his opportunity to become famous. But Darwin was simply a much better naturalist than McCormick, and that soon became clear to everyone. It wasn't long before the crew and the captain were treating Darwin as if he was the naturalist. The situation was, I suppose, somewhat understandably, unacceptable to McCormick. Before barely 4 months had elapsed, McCormick, with considerable resentment, left the Beagle in Brazil and returned home. Well, Darwin took right over. His accomplishments during the voyage lived up to Henslow's expectations. They marked Darwin as a skilled observer, and Darwin explored everything. Of the 5 years of the voyage, Darwin spent 3 years and 1 month exploring and living on land. The Brazilian rainforest just overpowered his senses. Only von Humboldt, he said, had given any advance warning, and he'd taken von Humboldt with him. Here's what he wrote: "I'm at present fit only to read von Humboldt. He, like another sun, illumines everything I behold." He gathered specimen after specimen, hoping his father would continue to pay for their shipment back to his professors in Cambridge. He was right in anticipating that his father would keep shelling out support. However strict Robert was, he must have realized that his son was involved in a grand adventure, and he probably wanted to be part of it. The ship spent some 2 years mapping the east coast of South America, and finally came to the southern tip, to Tierra del Fuego. Here the Beagle had a specific mission, literally On board was a missionary to the region, and he was accompanied by 3 Fuegians who had been picked up on an earlier voyage and taken back to England. There they'd all been civilized, or so it was hoped, and now they were returning with the English missionary as assistants in an experiment of evangelization. But alas, the experiment turned out to be a miserable failure. The Fuegians reverted immediately to their former existence, and the English missionary had to be taken back aboard. But Darwin learned an important lesson from the whole affair. He experienced just how thin the veneer of civilization could be. That certainly broadened his vision like nothing he could have seen back in England. It introduced Darwin to the idea that there was nothing sacred about civilization. Its power to affect human behavior was quite limited. Whatever else they were, humans were also animals, and on this level, there was continuity between cultivated Englishmen and savages. That would later help him see humankind as part of the natural world. Not everything Darwin thought about came directly from his experiences in remote parts of the earth. He'd taken things to read with him as well. I mentioned von Humboldt. He also took with him the first volume of Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology, which had just come out before he left. Henslow sent him volume 2 from home, which he got in Montevideo, Uruguay. What did he read in Lyell's books? Lyell, like James Hutton, whose theory of the earth we met back in lecture 3 and we've talked about several times, believed that nature's processes acted gradually and uniformly. In this, he went against his teacher, William Buckland, who had become a real champion of catastrophes in the 1820s. Lyell's view, obviously, again like Hutton's originally, required an enormous period of time for nature's regular action to occur. In fact, Lyell's view was that the Earth's condition had always been basically the same, a steady state. Lyell didn't think the Earth had progressed from a primitive state to a different one, the one of the present. In his steady state theory, the basic conditions on Earth have remained constant over time and have not developed from a primitive state to that of the present. In volume 2, Lyell even explained how some species had become extinct. It hadn't occurred as the result of catastrophes, as his teacher would have it. It came about as the result of a gradual process, according to Lyell. It didn't require any sudden changes in the landscape. So you can imagine how Darwin must have felt when in one of the regions he explored, where he'd found fossil remains of clearly extinct animals, there was no evidence of major landscape changes. The Beagle eventually made it around the tip of South America over to the western coast. Off the western shores of South America, Darwin visited the Galapagos Islands, a group of islands that are close to the equator. While he was there, he was primarily interested in their volcanic geological features. But of course, he also observed the indigenous species of living organisms. These islands are famous for the very large tortoises that are found there. These tortoises didn't swim like turtles do, so the tortoises were essentially prisoners on their islands. A British resident told Darwin that each island had its own species of tortoise. But Darwin failed to find the fact particularly interesting. He did, however, notice that mockingbirds on the islands were different, and he recorded that this paralleled what he'd been told about the tortoises. But he made no point of thinking about it further or making further observations about it. Well, after leaving the Galapagos, the Beagle traveled to more islands, this time in the South Pacific. Then they went to New Zealand and Australia, went to South Africa, then they took a quick jaunt back over to Brazil, finally came home to England by way of the Azores. The whole trip had taken 5 years. It was 1836. Darwin was now 25 years old. He'd had enough experience in the field to last most people a lifetime. As it turned out, it was encounters he'd had with the forms of life on the Galapagos Islands that would provide the occasion for the idea of evolution to make an appearance near the end of the voyage. During the last leg of the voyage, Darwin tried to rearrange his notes and sort his field notebooks. And that's when he came across a curious problem. He wasn't sure how to sort the Galapagos birds. Were they just varieties of one species, or did they represent different species? Here's what he wrote about the problem. When I see these islands in sight of each other, tenanted by these birds but slightly differing in structure and filling the same place in nature, I must suspect they are only varieties. And then the tortoises came back to his mind as well. They too must be varieties. But he jotted down an alternative suggestion, even though it had some astounding implications. If the tortoises were in fact different species, he said, it would undermine the stability of species. But why would one environment produce two different species, both adapted to it? That was something he couldn't understand. It wasn't until after he returned home that the idea of evolution really germinated and began to blossom. In fact, it was several months after his return in March of 1837 when Darwin consulted an expert about the problem with the Galapagos birds. He went to see John Gould, who was an ornithologist and taxonomist. He'd asked Gould to examine specimens of finches he'd collected on the Galapagos, and he wanted to hear what Gould had to say about them. Gould was very clear. The birds were definitely different species. They might even coordinate with individual islands. He couldn't be sure about that because the labeling wasn't clear enough to tell. But when other possible examples of multiple species in the same environment came to mind, the tortoises, for example, Darwin began to allow himself to consider the other alternative he'd mentioned. Maybe species aren't stable like everyone assumes. Well, not everyone. He had had an acquaintance at Edinburgh when he was a student there who was really into Lamarck. And then there was his grandfather, Erasmus's views. But his grandfather's ideas were part of a grandiose, poetic vision of life in its past. He hadn't based it on the kind of evidence that Darwin was now using. We can imagine, however, the growing excitement in Darwin's mind as he realized that he was taking the evolution of species seriously. What I mean is that Darwin knew he was coming to this idea because of some hard empirical information that didn't seem to make sense on any other ground. Not that they made all that much sense when seen as the result of evolution either. See, evolution wasn't a popular option at the time. Lamarck's work had been carefully reviewed by Lyell in his book, but only as a prelude to destroying it as a live option. So Darwin was treading on unpopular ground, and he was young. One of the things he'd thought about on board the Beagle was perhaps changing his mind about the ministry. Maybe he'd become a professor like Henslow. But if he did that, he sure wouldn't do his cause any good by embracing a viewpoint that most everyone who was important rejected and regarded as radical. So you can see the dilemma that Darwin faced. What we know is that by the end of June, the year after his return, we're talking about June 1837, Darwin had bought some new notebooks and was beginning a systematic consideration of what he had learned and what he thought. One of those notebooks was dedicated to the transmutation of species. So he was clear. He was going to explore this radical idea to see what it held for him. Naturally, he kept all this to himself. No sense having others jump all over him. Of course, he knew there were lots of problems with evolution, or transmutation, as he called it. Did it happen suddenly by jumps? How did it get started? Did geography and geology play a part by raising barriers? But for the next several years, as he worked hard on developing what he soon began to call my theory, he came up with an idea that would help. This was the idea of natural selection. We'll look more at the working out of his theory in Lecture 20 when we examine the making of his great work, The Origin of Species. But in our next lecture, we'll learn about a sensational development of the 1840s that convinced Darwin more than ever not to make his radical ideas public.